You just got to live through it as it's happening. And sometimes that's not very nice feeling.
This is Interfering Neurotic with me, Dr. Ash King, and mindfulness coach Darren Larson, where we navigate a life lived with the curses and blessings of big feelings.
Are you an expert at the sulk and serving up the silent treatment? It can be hard enough managing our own big feelings, but what about when we need to let our loved ones in on our emotional chaos in a way that won't leave them running for the hills? In this ep, we chat about pre-gaming emotional tiffs before they blow out, growing out of the allure of the soulmate and having grown-up conversations, sharing observations, feelings, and stating what we need in our relationships, and what happens when we say what we want, but we still don't get it. This is Interfering Neurotic. We talk about having big feelings and what we do with those big feelings. Darren, what are you doing with your life at the moment? What are you into?
I've got some interesting workshops and stuff going on, but I was going to ask you if you're watching Severance. There's been like a 3-year pause between the first season and the second season beginning. Is that on your radar? Where are you with your viewing of that
Yeah,
show?
I started watching it, but it was I had to watch it on my computer and I like watching it on my TV, so I only made it about halfway. So I kind of know the premise. But I think that I actually stop watching when it starts to get really good. So I need to get back into it.
I think that's true. I would encourage you to get through the first season because the last two episodes, I think, are some of the most propulsive things I've seen on television in a long time. I
Wow.
can't believe it's been 3 years. I had to go back and watch the last two to get ready for the new season just to try to remind myself because there's some weird aspects to it. But I think why it's significant for you and I to talk about is I'm fascinated by this idea of compartmentalizing ourselves and cutting ourselves off from, our personal life versus our work life. I think it's a brilliant theme to explore. And I have this theory that the driving theme is emotional pain. Like I feel like that's the undercurrent to the whole story that people who are choosing to sever their outside self from their any work self is they're avoiding emotional pain back in their real lives. So anyway, maybe when you catch up, we'll have to have an episode to unpack some of the stuff that's going on in that world. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but so anyone who's listening, I'd love to know if our feelers out there, how they're reacting to the themes of that TV show if they're watching. So yeah. So I thought today we could talk about, we mentioned at the last of our last conversation, at the tail end of our last conversation, something about how we engage with other people, not just how we look inward and get intimately familiar with what we're feeling and navigate all those challenges, but then how do we connect with other people, the special people in our lives, important people, our romantic partners, that kind of stuff. So there's this theme I want to talk to you about. See if you can relate to it. I kind of hope you can relate, and I also hope you can't for your own well-being. But I have a sort of talent that I used to really lean into, I would say for most of my adult life in relationship, which is to like a silent treatment when I'm upset. So if I'm in a relationship and there's been some misunderstanding or disagreement or I've got my feelings hurt, there's this tendency. The only way someone knows I'm upset is that I'm not talking because I'm usually talking. Is
Mm.
that something you can relate to? Do you have a silent treatment mode or a pouting?
I I had an instant flashback to high school when you asked about this, and I remember my girlfriends did something that they kind of made fun of me or I don't know, made snarky comments, and they really upset me, and I just went totally silent. And my friends were kind of like, "Are you okay? Like, what's wrong?" And I'd be like, "Nothing," like nothing, nothing. And that was a staple of my adolescent years is this sort of seething silently, sulking, and not really using my words to communicate any of it.
Okay. And does it come up in your in your relationships and did it come up in your marriage and stuff? That was did your husband know you were upset because you weren't talking? that did that continue on in that way?
You know, it's funny that you ask that because I feel like I know better now, right? Like rationally, I know that you need to use your words and communicate what you're
Oh.
feeling and what's going on for you. And in reality, there was so many things that I was feeling that I never ever spoke about. And I wouldn't maybe describe them as sulking, like that he needed to say the right thing in order to draw them out of me. It was more the fact that I maybe was undermining my own emotional experience and going, well, this is my issue and I should deal with it, as opposed to expressing any
Oh.
of it and lumping any of it on him. Or maybe this isn't a big deal and I'm feeling like it's a big deal. So therefore, I need to sort my feelings out first.
So it was kind of like a private sorting out on his behalf, but not wanting to make a. I mean, that sounds kind of mature, right? I mean, not wanting to pull him into some trap or whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe I've just been more rough around the edges. I I think I didn't realize the degree to which I was relying on if I'm talking, things are fine, and if I'm not talking, something's not fine. But I'm not going to help you in through this process. But there was a thing I heard years ago from Alain de Botton. Very familiar with the School of Life guide. I think
Mhm.
he's British. I like his stuff. But he was on a podcast talking about a novel he'd written, a romantic comedy of some kind. But there was a character who was relying on sulking. And I'm like, oh, I have never heard of anyone talk about this in a way that was so relatable. And I don't, it's one of those things where you don't know, you just assume everyone must be experiencing this like I do. So I'd be really curious to hear from our listeners if silent treatment, sulking, pouting is a factor or a feature of their relationships, and if that's what they're how they're handling that. So what he said that I found so helpful was that there was this teaching component to a relationship, which doesn't sound very romantic, but needing to teach the person you're with what you need, what you want, what you need, what you're feeling,
Yes.
right? This gets to this topic that you brought up at the end last time of there's one problem in me knowing what I'm feeling and what I want and what I need. And then there's this challenge of how do I convey that to someone who it might not be obvious to them what I'm even talking about. And Elena Baton talks about this idea that when we're sulking, we want someone to just know if you love me, if you really love me, you know me well enough to know what I want and need and feel.
Hmm.
It's kind of this one episode you and I talked about this tendency I have to feel like I can read someone else's mind. And it's kind of a reciprocal thing where if we're really close, why don't you know me well enough to know what I'm thinking and feeling? I don't know. I don't know if
Is
this is
it,
relatable.
I want you to tell me, is it like a test? Is it like a period where you're giving someone an opportunity, say your partner, the opportunity to ask the right questions or do the right things in order to help you feel better? Or do you think that it's a response of being not super comfortable with the awkwardness and vulnerability that is required to actually give voice to what's going on for you?
I think it's like I think it's a combination of those two things. And it's sort of like it feels like a defense that feels really like, oh yeah, this is the right thing. I'm going silent. Aha. It's like, it is a bit of it feels a bit punitive. It's and you should have known. It has a tone. It feels like you should have known. And it is a bit of a test, I think, to be honest, because have you noticed I'm not talking? But then if you, like you said, if he asks, is something wrong? No, I'm fine. Fine.
Mm.
Everything's fine. So it's this weird, it has a gamey quality, but I don't think it was ever intentional. I think that maybe it would help to talk about sort of a time where we unpacked it a little bit to sort of get to the bottom of it. because what I think ultimately for me, what has helped me to move from this kind of punitive testing period of I do think there's somewhat unintentional, but it has a romantic notion. You should know. If you love me, you should know.
I think that also there is, yeah, the romantic aspect to it. Because I think, sulking, maybe you associate it with teenagers and their parents, but definitely within relationships, it might maybe has that dual aspect. What I was talking about thinking on one end, it's not a big deal. I shouldn't make a big
Yeah,
thing of this. So it's
totally,
it's kind of
totally.
like you're trying to be the parent grown up. Maybe it's like, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to bring it up. I don't want this to blow out and go out of control and make a whole hoo-ha out of nothing. But your experience, your emotional experience of whatever it is
Yeah,
so extreme that you actually are not talking about it or not able just to
that's right.
casually talk about it. And I think that that's the size of that inner experience and the fact that potentially your
Mm,
partner did not recognize how much that could impact you feels a little bit like, I mean, what planet are you on to think that
right.
whatever happened or whatever just occurred between us, like, was not going to do what it did to me? So again, it's kind of like, well, you must not know me to the depths of which I want to be known or need to be known by.
Or thought I was known. You've said it so well. The funny thing is, I think that, so I've been in a relationship a really long time, and we've got the day-to-day life stuff really, we've had a lot of that sorted out for years. But on vacation, it's funny. This is when we have learned that we're likely to run into these problems because we're both very accommodating people. So we're great guests. You should have us over because we'll leave when you want us to, and we'll have a good time. We won't overstay our welcome. We'll clean up after ourselves, all of it. So we're really accommodating, but we're both accommodating. So on vacation, it can be paralyzing both to be in the accommodating role and no one really having something that they need. And
Mm,
especially if you add like a tour group. So we've gone on hiking tours in different places in the world, and we've gone on these swimming trips. And there's this thing that will come up where there's something about how we're socializing with the group that I get this feeling of distance, and that my partner is performing a character and connecting with other people, and I'm feeling left out of that. So
mm,
my initial, actually, this is helpful to me to try to explain it better. I'm not starting with test, and I'm not starting with you should know. I'm starting with it hurts. First, I'm lonely.
mm,
Wait, what? Wait, why have you abandoned me? I thought we were going on a vacation together, and you seem to be so chummy with everybody else, but I'm not feeling it between us. And so we have it's not his intention at all, but he will realize a couple days into it, wait, Darren hasn't been talking much. Am I in trouble? And then it's a lot to unpack. One time I decided, let's, instead of just waiting for this to blow up and become a thing, because it's sort of it had a pattern aspect to it. Because we're going on these open water swim things with a lot of other people. And so one time we had the foresight to kind of pre-game it.
mhm,
And I was able to say, you know what? In past, I've noticed this, and I really would like for this trip for us to feel like we've kind of are in this together. So I noticed that when we go around the circle and introduce ourselves, there's couples and there's single people, and the couples have a way of sort of presenting together, and the single people have a way of presenting like a single person. And what I observe when you're doing your turn is it sort of sounds like, because he's the swimmer, I'm kind of tagging along.
mm.
You're performing this role, and is there a way we can introduce ourselves as being together right from the start? And it was like it really shifted the whole thing, because on previous trips we had to unpack all the hurt feelings and things that were unintended and confusing. But being able to say, I observe this, here's how I'm feeling. I know that's not your intention, but I really would prefer if there's a way to go about this together. Can we try this instead to see if we can feel closer throughout as much of this vacation as possible instead of having this repeated discord between us. So I don't know. I'm wondering if that'll be interesting to people to hear. I think it's interesting what goes on behind the scenes, right? In any couple's struggle to stay connected in different situations.
I mean, that approach that you just mentioned is so extremely high in emotional intelligence, particularly the pre-gaming aspect too, when it's like, let's talk about it when when I'm not heightened or my
Exactly.
emotional experience is clouding the way that I can speak about this. Like hearing that, I would recognize my experience of that would be, oh, I would be embarrassed for myself
Yep.
to have to admit that this is how I'm experiencing that. Because again, this is not their intention and they didn't mean for me to be feeling this way. And so therefore I'd turn it back on myself and go,
Yeah.
it's your fault that you're feeling this way and you need to manage that. And you know what? That was a huge contributor to so much of what I contributed to the fallout of my relationship, because there were so many moments when I didn't speak up because I undermined my emotional experience at every single turn. And I'm just so sometimes when I hang around with other people and the things that they'll just say to their partner, just about, that when you do that, that's really annoying to me. And they'll just say that like at the time when it's happening. And I'd just be like,
That's
are
an
you
option?
are you telling me that you don't need to be annoyed in the moment, recognize the annoyance, think about the annoyance, think about how you were the one who contributed to your own experience of being annoyed, and then try to let it go? And it's cool if you can let it go. And I think there's often things in relationships that, yeah, they just come up for a burst and then they go. But I think what I failed to realize is that these experiences that I was having, they just kept on layering on top
Ah,
of the other. They weren't actually being processed and let go because it was a part of a relational dynamic and where we needed to work together in order to both be
mm,
understanding and processing. And he obviously had his own on his end
mm.
that I didn't know about either, that he thought he was in charge of managing. So when you are in a relationship, especially someone that you spend a lot of time with, there needs to be some shared language of what's going on emotionally for you and an understanding that someone might be feeling in ways that you're not familiar with.
Totally. Yeah, and when you said it was an emotionally intelligent way to go, but I think I relate to some aspect of how you're describing your approach, but then I reach a wall. Like I think I do start with this must be my fault. I must be doing something wrong. I need to address this. But then I slam into a wall that is just like more like paralysis where it feels like I don't know how to solve it. And so therefore it starts to feel like a resentment. So I feel like I had less ability to tolerate the the discomfort of that kind of stuck feeling. And so I would just start talking. And I want to be clear that this is a strategy that came after, kind of multiple iterations over years of not nailing it. And sort of like a mutual, like, you know what? If there was a way to not have this become a thing, wouldn't that be worth trying? So are you willing to try? He's like, oh yeah. And the other part of that is he wants it to go well too. He's not having the same emotional experience. He's not having this feeling in his experience of the socializing. So he's invested in it. Not he doesn't want me to be feeling lonely on a trip, right? So, there was something that has helped me with this. There's this framework that comes from nonviolent communication. There's a book out there by a guy who combines mindfulness and nonviolent communication. His name is it's Oren J. Sofer, I believe. And I think the book is called Say What You Mean. I hope I'm getting that right. I'll have to double check and put it in the notes. But without going, I don't want to learn a whole new terminology. And I don't want the person who I'm talking to, like we've talked about this before, I don't want them to know I'm using a system. But it helps me to navigate the part that, you know, we've all heard don't use iMessages, and then the first thing we do is use iMessages. But this framework helps me break it down, and I'll try to explain why I think it's so useful. So the idea is to not keep it at an abstract level. And it's not like you always do this, but it's more like try to describe a specific observation, right? So I've noticed when we're part of a group, this is what I see happening when we go to describe ourselves. It's a specific observation. So observation, then feeling. When this happens, I start to feel disconnected, sad, like I'm not part of the group. So this is how I'm feeling. And that feels very uncomfortable to have to admit because it feels like I shouldn't feel this way, but I do feel this way.
Yeah.
And then the part where it really gets gnarly, and I think this has to be part of the neurotic component of my personality. It's easier for me to be mad or to pout or to go silent than to say, I'm feeling sad and what I need is this, or what I want, what I'm asking for is this, because there's something about number one, if I don't know what I want or need, how is someone supposed to read my mind and figure that out? That's not realistic.
Mm.
But it's really vulnerable, I think, to say, can we introduce ourselves as a couple and la da dee da da, but partly because, and I think this is again important to me, just because I want it or need it doesn't mean the person is capable or interested, right, in
And that's
fulfilling that.
and that's scary, and that was my experience where I recognize I have not been good in expressing what I was feeling. And when I started to get on board with it and making those requests, there was limited capacity to be able to meet them. And that felt horrifying. It felt horrifying when you go, this is the person that I entrust with
Uh,
my, relational well-being and this dynamic that we share. And yet they, the battle that I have is it that they can't or they don't want to? And that sends me off in overthinking universe. But
yeah.
if they can't meet those needs, if they can't meet the request, then what?
Then what? Who are we? What are we supposed to do? It's terrifying. I think we don't talk enough about how intimacy requires, like, it's almost like learning to acclimate to how vulnerable some of this actually really is. Because if as long as I try to micromanage myself and have fewer needs or fewer wants or be the what I'm really interested in this framing that you're bringing up today about, I can manage this.
Mm.
It's a really compelling idea because then that way I don't have to discover this. What if this person doesn't
Can't.
have an
Yeah.
interest,
Yeah.
can't
Can't
or
or
doesn't
won't.
want to? Either way, I'm kind of screwed.
It's
It's a
too
very vulnerable.
it's
Yeah.
so scary. And I think that's where I've had to give myself some self-compassion to realize that of course it's scary to put yourself out there and to put yourself out there in order to maybe hear what you're so scared of hearing and then hearing it, consequently hearing it. And now as I slowly wade through the potential of meeting new people, and you kind of have this sweet
Mm.
period where you don't have to
Yeah.
have any of these conversations and you can still imagine that you're this idealized person in the other person's eyes because they don't know any of the inner junk
Yeah.
that you're dealing with because you're not going, well, when this happened, I felt this. And what I need from you is like, would they just think that you're absolutely off this
Right.
planet to bring that up on like the third day?
I do think that there's it's luckily you don't need to rely on tools like that for a long time. I think first you've got chemistry and you've got compatibility and you've got this period of time where it's just like normal people doing normal things. And I think it's when we bump up against those inevitable walls. We have
Hmm.
to pull out the tools. And that's where it's important to me that this can't sound like a therapy session and it can't sound like terminology. And so if anything, I will adjust how I'm saying it to sound as conversational and natural as possible.
Mm.
But I do think if you're in a relationship with me, you're going to realize that you're going to be on your game because I'm coming to the table with an emotional awareness that you might not be ready for. So that's what is going to be required in a relationship with me, right?
Mm.
And hopefully, I'm kind of convinced that anybody I would be attracted to enough to have a long-term relationship is going to have a counterbalance to that and come at it with a more analytical. Can we also say that there's some degree of luck in all relationships where sometimes the person that you are with and that you're committed to is not going to be able to meet some of those needs. And then that's your new problem to figure out what are you going to do about that? Because I don't think that necessarily has to mean the end of every relationship, but it certainly means how am I going to get that need met?
Well, for
And
me, it was that none of the needs could be met. And I would be more than happy to hold out for a certain amount of people, like, because I was
yeah,
going along that way anyway. But again, there needs to be some reciprocity and understanding in
right.
relationships. And okay, so wait, I want to go back though. You were saying that in order to be in a relationship with you, there is some level of emotional acuity required, and they need to be able to get onto the same page. I've thought this same thing, and it's an essential component, but it's like one of those things where even if you like put it on your bloody Hinge profile, like, and you're like looking
No, you
looking for
can't.
someone with like good EQ, like emotional intelligence or whatever, like everyone can think that they have that. No one's going to be like, oh,
Oh,
I have really low emotional intelligence. No. No one is going to
well,
consider that about themselves, don't you think?
oh, and when I had the least amount of emotional intelligence, I thought I was high in it. I thought I am really in touch with my feelings. No, Darren, you are dramatic and you have big feelings that rule every action and behavior in your life. That's
Yes.
different from being able to have some kind of a little bit of objectivity, I guess is what I'm saying about that. But no, I don't think it does end up on your Hinge profile. But I do want, it'll be so interesting as you're going along. At what point what I hear though is at some point you will, in your future, right? It's inevitable.
Mm.
You're going to find yourself starting to talk yourself into I should be able to figure this out on my own without communicating it. And that's your little red flag to decide. I wonder if if this person seems trustworthy or up to the task of me going there. Because if I'm going to be vulnerable, I first need to vet you to make sure that you can handle that or that I'm invested enough. Because if I'm admitting what I feel and want and need in however language I'm able to put that, I'm not going to do that with just anybody. So you're kind of, isn't that what dating maybe is? Vetting these people by, I wonder what you think about this. It just occurred to me. I love subtext. I love a movie where the most important details are not what's in the dialogue.
Yeah.
And I think this is important to me in my real life too, that it's like I don't need Christmas and Father's Day cards, but I need to feel that we're close in the day to day. And so the subtext is conveying a lot. I have a feeling you probably must have. I wonder if this is a thing, people with big feelings, we're not content to just read the script. We're scrutinizing facial expression and tone and vibe and how we're making eye contact across the room and feeling like we're communicating.
Mm.
That's just as important as being able to list what you want and need and feel. So it's sort of like we're we're making sure is this person bright enough and self-aware? And I think the luckiest thing you can ever find in someone is a willing to learn to be willing to learn about who you are and what you feel and what you need and have an investment in that. And then the uncomfortable role is to be that teacher. Let me teach you about how I experience the world and what I need and what I want and what I'm looking for. And if this ends up that we're compatible, that would be awesome.
It would
Uh,
be it would be cool if there was some sort of VR exercise that you could do because it's true that it's kind of hard to assess that. I mean, I do like having deep conversations with people up front, but it's one thing to talk about emotions or philosophy or psychological theories or concepts like that exist out there. It's
oh, right.
very different if it's something that you yourself are feeling and maybe
Yes,
are
right.
feeling at the time or very close to the time that has a link with the other person. So the other person is somehow involved in this emotional experience. And
Right.
sometimes that doesn't always the opportunities to get insight into how the other person might go. This is kind of where I'm at the moment, having a curiosity at maybe this person that I've been sort of seeing for past few months, like how would he go when certain things need to be discussed, or would he bring certain things up with me? How comfortable do I feel bringing certain things up
Uh-huh.
with him? And then I go, oh, is it you're thinking about this? So does that mean that you just don't feel comfortable and
Right.
he's not the right person for me? Like maybe. So again, then I try to intellectualize it. But
Well, that's an ongoing thing, and I do think these things are like, unfortunately, the timeline isn't always in our hands. This is maybe thin ice for me to get on, but like when my daughter was old enough to start thinking about serious relationships, and she would ask me, how is it that you guys have such a healthy relationship? And I said, well, first you start by finding someone who seems like your soulmate, like they complete you, and then you marry them and you realize, oh, this is not a good recipe. What I signed up for originally, I thought was one thing, but then the lived experience of that thing felt depleting. I think for both of us, if I can't speak for her. In my experience, it was I found someone who I thought, oh my gosh, we're so compatible. We're meant to be together. Da, 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 da. It was ridiculous looking back, but at the time, it felt very real. And then the healthy relationship I ended up in felt nothing like that. It didn't feel like a soulmate. It felt like, oh my gosh, I have got to take responsibility for my own feelings. And he doesn't need me to micromanage his. Who am I in this relationship if this person doesn't have big needs?
mm,
That's a challenge for me. But part of it is luck, but I think part of it is it's going to feel vulnerable if there's healthy intimacy involved. But that's different from the kind of discomfort we fear of being in an unhappy relationship, right? So it's very nuanced and it's amazing that it ever works. That you find someone because ultimately you can only do your part of the relationship and you're dependent and vulnerable to need that other person to deliver. So I think the best we can do is vet someone to see, is this a trustworthy person? Is this a conscientious person? Is this a kind person? How do they treat other people? Do they have any difficult people in their lives, or do they just chuck difficult people, right? I feel like that's a pattern in the world now that I would be leery of. If every previous girlfriend was terrible, it's never their fault. That kind of stuff. I'm
yeah, the
always sensitive.
crazy ex-girlfriends. Yeah, that's a red flag now. If you hear people talking about their exes like that, you're just a bit like, but at the same time, I sometimes feel like, when you date these new people, I was like, I would like to actually just sit down with your ex for
Totally.
copy.
That would save us all so much time. I really need to hear the other side. Wouldn't that would end most like romantic comedy movies if you could just sit down with the ex and ask, how did this really go from your perspective? Well, because, and we probably have to wind this down. This is one of my favorite topics. One of my favorite topics in the world is this idea that a relationship requires the work of two people, right? And so when people tell me about their failed relationships and they only have the one, they are the victim of this other. I mean, I know there's extreme examples out there in the world, but I think there's a lot of wiggle room where people see themselves as not contributing to that healthy dynamic that could have been, and they
Mm,
see themselves as just the victim of that. So I'm always listening for, in any scenario, there's strengths and weaknesses. So what strengths and weaknesses did your ex have, and what strengths and weaknesses do you have? What do you have to be careful for as you're going about? And if people are not able to see the world in that way, that I have strengths and weaknesses and so does other people in my life, if everything's good or bad, I get nervous, you know, because we're not going to have something perfect. I just want to have something that's warm and hospitable and close.
mm.
Um, uh, and that's a tall order actually in the world of human relationship. Then that way though, I don't need to be perfect and you don't need to be perfect, but we do need to learn how to talk to each other and we have to learn how to convey emotions in a way that is, open, teachable, let's just say to consider the possibility that your partner might be feeling something and observing something different from you. Are we able to have conversation? If you can have conversations like that, I think it goes a long way.
Absolutely. And I think that what I will be mindful of looking out for if these types of conversations inevitably do come up, because emotions and emotional experiences are part of our lives, particularly for those of us
Right.
who have big feelings. The four horsemen that Gottman labels as contributors to the fallout of relationships, I think you can notice them early on in the way that someone responds to some level of emotional disclosure or personal disclosure, which is defensiveness. So
Mm,
someone's like, "Well, I didn't mean to do that." Like, that's
yeah.
your fault because I didn't mean that at all. Contempt, which is like a lack of respect or even a lack of being acknowledged as a full human being. Stonewalling, which is kind of the sulk
Mm,
that we talked about,
uh-huh,
kind of the
uh-huh.
shut down and not being open to discussing and going any deeper into things, right? And then criticism. So, I mean, that feels a little bit more
Mm,
active, whereas the stonewalling, or I would say the sulk, is a bit more passive. I think maybe the sulk can turn into stonewalling if you kind of double down on it. So the sulk might just be an immediate response, and then you might be more open to having a conversation. But if you're so habitual in this, I'm not going to
right.
talk, I'm going to shut down, I don't want to go there, I don't want to talk about it. Like all these things kind of point to someone who does not have the interest or curiosity or emotional intelligence to go, let's talk about how this feels for you and how it feels for me too.
Well, and these are new to me. I'm not familiar with those. I'm absolutely compelled to learn more about these, and maybe just hearing that description is enough. But I also think if we're honest, we all have the ability to display all of those. Like I have that in me.
Yeah.
And there's something I find this liberating too, is I can be with a different person and it's going to bring out different aspects of my
Oh, yeah.
personality,
Yes.
right? And so I might be with someone and I might get defensive because it's warranted
Yeah.
with, or it's a response, it's an accurate response. So I feel like there's some willingness to say it's just a difference of degrees, and if I see a obvious pattern, I have to take that into account. The
Mm.
other thing, and I know we could probably keep talking all night and or all day for you. When you were listing those, I thought you're also describing American politics, and I don't think that's inaccurate because I do think there's a dynamic where this marriage is very troubled right now. And so far, we've got two partners who are expecting the other person to change, the other party to change. And neither party is going to change. We're going to double down and go deeper and deeper. And it might not go well if there's a divorce on a national scale of some kind. But I find that fascinating that this kind of insight can scale all the way down. And it's not just, I'm assuming it's not just romantic relationships, because relationships with significant friends and family members, there's qualities of defensiveness and criticism and stonewalling that can come up. So, I can be aware of my own and not have blinders on when I'm vetting people as being worthy as someone I want to invest, emotion and time in the future. I don't know what else we can do, and just keep trying,
Yeah,
keep working
keep
at it.
experimenting and being open.
Yeah,
I think benefit of the doubt is good, but you also need to know when to cut your losses and realize
totally,
that I
totally.
can't get what I need to get here or what I deserve to get. And
Yep.
those experiences are really tough, but yeah,
Yep.
we
Sometimes
go.
it's good to nip it in the bud, and sometimes there's a lot to learn from finding out. There is a natural evolution to some of this too. We can't rush, I don't think.
No, you just got to live through it as it's going, as it's happening. And sometimes that's not very nice feeling.
No, it's not. It's not. It's not fair. It's not fair. Life is not fair.
On that note,
All
we'll
right.
say goodbye. Thank you so much, Darren. Thanks everyone for listening. If you've got any ideas or anything that you'd like us to explore, then please let us know. You can send us emails, hit us up in the DMs, Instagram, sign up to our newsletter. We'll be back talking about big feelings and all that other good stuff in our next episode.
All right. Look forward to it. Take care, Ash.